Hello, welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. Today's date is the 4th of June 2014. Welcome to all listeners. Thanks for listening to Truth Sentinel. We do appreciate you taking the time out to listen to us. Currently in London and UK at the moment, but we'll be on the move again to Odessa, Ukraine soon, probably next week, just to see what's going on there. Today's news: a terrorism trial could be heard entirely in secret for the first time in an English court. Just another example of how things are changing. So we're going to have secret trials now. You know, things have changed over the last 10 years basically. You can be detained without trial. Guantanamo Bay is an example of that. And we also reported that there's obviously secret detainees at Diego Garcia, which was focused on due to MH370 missing plane. Senior judges have been hearing that the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK wants the criminal case to be dealt with completely behind closed doors on grounds of national security. Again, this use of national security and terrorism. And it seems like whenever you mention national security and terrorism, it means you can do whatever you like. And they've already proved that they're not actually sticking to the agreement, because they detained Glenn Greenwald's partner at Heathrow Airport under terrorism laws when he's clearly not a terrorist. Okay, other news. Top-ranking US military officer has raised the possibility of Sergeant Bo Bugdal being prosecuted if he abandoned his post before his capture. This is the guy that was released on Saturday after 5 years in Taliban captivity. Alex Jones pointed out that it's surprising that this guy managed to stay for 5 years without being harmed, as he was being held by particularly violent captors, suggesting that perhaps he'd switched sides, a bit like that TV program Homeland. Barack Obama defended his decision to free 5 senior Taliban leaders to secure the release of Sergeant Bugdal. Barack Obama has also condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine, saying it was using dark tactics, basically. He said, "How can we allow the dark tactics of the 20th century to define the 21st? It's just quite strange when he says stuff like that, when, you know, he's obviously involved in allowing the NSA spying to go on the whole population of the world, basically. So, you know, he's one to talk about dark tactics. Basically, Obama met President Petro Poroshenko of Russian chocolate fame and pledged support for him and offered $5 million of military assistance to Kiev. I mean, it's obviously they're gearing up again for a war. I'm going to Ukraine in next week, hoping that things will be safe there at least. Obviously not safe in the eastern Ukraine. I'm going to be more in sort of south Ukraine. Obama's also pledged night goggles, food, clothes, rations, radios and other equipment. And Obama's now in Brussels for a meeting of the G7 industrial nations. Obviously the G8 has changed now as Russia's been removed. Today's episode is mostly about protests, unrest and uprisings, and police in Nigeria's capital have banned all protests planned in support of the more than 200 girls kidnapped in April. Other protests: Indian police have fired water cannons to disperse hundreds of protesters in Uttar Pradesh, where two teenage cousins were gang raped and hanged. Protesters, many of whom were women, were demonstrating outside the office of State Chief Minister Akhilesh Yadav. Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan called CNN correspondent Ivan Watson an agent working for foreign governments. Istanbul police had interrupted a live CNN broadcast on Saturday and briefly held Watson, who's been a Istanbul correspondent for some time. He was reporting on the first anniversary of Turkey's biggest anti-government protests in decades at the Gezi Park area, and we'll be going to Antony later on in today's broadcast. This week's news: riot police were on standby as tens of thousands took to the streets in Madrid, Barcelona and other cities across Spain on Monday to demand a vote on whether to rid Spain of its royal family. I wonder if we could do that here as well. This comes after Spain's King Juan Carlos has said that he's going to abdicate and promoting his son Philippe as the new king, Prince Philippe, and would presumably take the title King Philippe IV. Far-left parties have called for a national referendum to abolish Spain's monarchy. Sudanese authorities are to free a woman who was sentenced to death for having abandoned the Islamic faith, which is punishable by death in most Islamic traditions. If you decide later on you don't want to be a Muslim, you can be executed. And this has been condemned by some other world leaders, including the UK's Prime Minister Cameron. Police at Heathrow Airport arrested a 19-year-old man suspected of terror offences. He was detained by counter-terror SO15 officers on suspicion of preparing for acts of terrorism. And they said it was Syria related. I wonder whether he was one of the rebels, because that would be a bit strange, because our government was actively supporting the rebels up until a few months ago at least. Police can now just arrest people and say it's because of terrorism. Even in this case, they've admitted this is not in response to any immediate risk or threat. I would have thought that was the point of these terrorism laws, some immediate risk or threat. Also this week, a Bilderberg meeting occurred in Copenhagen, Denmark. It's been a year since the last one, which is in Watford, England, which I attended. I met some interesting people there, Alex Jones and David Icke amongst them. And there was quite a few hundred people there, going into the thousands actually. There was a lot of people not let in. The police stopped people coming in, and we were held in a field which was in view of where the Bilderberg conference was going on. It was a great atmosphere, and there was lots of speakers. This year apparently there was a lot less people. It was in a more isolated part of Copenhagen in Denmark, and just less people were able to make it there. But I know that Alex Jones and David Icke were also reporting on that conference there. Who are the Bilderberg Group? According to their website, founded in 1954, it's an annual conference designed to foster dialogue between Europe and North America. About 100 to 150 political leaders and experts from industry, finance, academia and the media are invited to take part in the conference. So funny it says media there, because you very rarely get any reports from inside, so it must be maybe they mean editors of newspapers who they control anyway. It's supposed to be for informal discussions and no policies made there, although the idea of them all meeting together and it not actually influencing policy, when they say that it's the very rare occasion when they can actually all express their views. I think the idea that there's no policy made, maybe they don't sign it inside the conference, but I'm sure it does affect policy. Anyway, my problem with it is it shouldn't be secret, you know. If there's nothing to hide, as they say to us, then tell us what's going on. And I think part of the problem is also that we just generally don't like these people. So when they start meeting in secret, it really riles us, you know. I think that's the root cause. We don't like these people anyway, so we don't like them meeting in secret. A deal has been reached on the release of the gist of the Blair-Bush-Iraq talks. This is an absolute joke. Details of the gist talks between Tony Blair and George Bush before the Iraq War are to be published, the UK's Chilcot inquiry says. But transcripts and full notes of conversations will remain secret at the request of the government. Just about everything's secret these days if it's likely to be of any importance. Basically, they're going to release some of the details of the conversations, but they're going to delete anything that could be a violation of national security or impair relations between the two countries. So you're just going to have a complete whitewashed conversation. Okay, a roundup of last episodes. Last episode we had a debate about religion. 2-hour episode, over 2 hours. We were talking about atheism and Christianity in particular, but also we touched on Islam and Buddhism. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that, it's quite an interesting episode. Makes you think about the meaning of life and why we're here, and I think it's good to examine your beliefs and have a sit down sometimes and think about what this is all about. Sometimes I stop and think, you know, what is all this about, and it blows my mind that we're part of whatever this is, this game that we seem to be living in. It's almost like a computer game. Remember to please leave comments in the comments section if you've got anything you'd like us to talk about. We're always open to ideas. Remember, this is your channel just as much as it is ours. We invite guests on who are listeners. We had Michael on the last episode, so if you feel like you could talk about something, you're knowledgeable about a certain subject, please get in touch. scottssentinel9@gmail.com. Today I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you myself and talk about the theme of today's episode, which is protests, uprising, unrests. I think it was exactly 25 years ago yesterday when more than 1 million Chinese students and workers occupied Beijing's Tiananmen Square. And the protests there, who knows what they've achieved. I mean, there's still obviously a lot of censorship and control in China. But there's been so many uprisings and protests in the last sort of 10-15 years. We had the Arab Spring, a revolutionary wave of demonstrations and protests, violent and non-violent, in the Arab world, which began in 2010. By 2013, rulers had been forced from power in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria, although obviously an ongoing situation there. Also Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait and Sudan. There's protests in Venezuela, in Caracas, which started this year in February, turned deadly when 3 people were shot by gunmen following a peaceful march that day. There have been many demonstrations since then, varying in size from small gatherings to large rallies. We've had the Maidan protests, uprising and revolution in Ukraine. Whether that's been successful is a matter of opinion. It doesn't look good at the moment, that's for sure. I think maybe some people who are involved in these protests and uprising have the right sense of meaning, and they mean well, but then sometimes other people come along and start infiltrating groups and change the actual outcome of what people are trying to do. In Turkey we have the Gezi Park protests, and we'll be talking to Anthony later about them as they're still continuing. Thailand, some of which I witnessed the protests there. I was in Khao San Road, which was a few streets away from one area of protests in Bangkok. I saw thousands of people who closed a road down. There was a really good atmosphere there. It was like a festival. People were selling t-shirts. There was barbecue stands, loads of people lying on the roads, sleeping on the roads with sleeping bags. There were musicians, a giant screen with a political leader talking. It was a great atmosphere. It wasn't necessarily reported that way. It was reported that, you know, there was obviously a small section of people throwing smoke grenades and that in another part of Bangkok. And that just seems to be the area the media will latch onto. People protesting against the military coup in Thailand now have started using a 3-fingered salute, recalling the gesture of defiance seen in the popular film Hunger Games. It's a sign with 3 middle fingers are held up, used as an expression of silent protest against the fictional authoritarian state called Panem in Catching Fire, the second film in the Hunger Games trilogy. Of course, that's been in the news again in the last couple of weeks due to the son of the assistant director going on the rampage in California, killing half a dozen people. Half of those he did with a knife, although people are obviously campaigning for guns to be taken away in the States. I used to be, as I mentioned before, I used to be someone who thought, well, you know, why do we need guns? And there, you know, you can definitely make a case that in an ideal society we don't need guns, but we're not living in an ideal society anymore. And if there's any time in history when Americans need to keep hold of their guns, it's probably now, when you've got governments which are just going out of control at the moment. Okay, other protests that happened in the last 10 years, there was the G8 summit protests in the UK, or rather there wasn't. Why wasn't there? Because the police went in and arrested 57 people in a raid before the protests, despite the fact that it's supposed to be a human right to protest, or it's supposed to be part of our laws that we have the right to protest. Not anymore, that's been taken away. Riot police raided the central London headquarters of anti-G8 protesters, and hundreds of officers were deployed in the capital as protests took place against the G8 summit that was going to be held the next day. Some people tried to actually kill themselves, saying they didn't want to be part of a police state, and the police had to stop one guy from jumping off the roof of the building. Also, of course, protesters are more and more being classified as extremists and even terrorists in some cases. And also the citizens of countries are being criminalized. Checks at airport almost assume that everyone's a terrorist, confiscating everything, even though they know full well you're not a terrorist. That's the point. Nobody's complaining about people searching people before they get on a plane. We all want to be safe. But since they know that basically the stuff they're taking off you is not dangerous, they're confiscating hundreds and hundreds of thousands of deodorants pointlessly, in my opinion. I mean, if a terrorist wanted to kill someone or wanted to blow a plane up, then they can get something on board just by confiscating all the deodorant. You're not stopping terrorism that way. It's just a ploy to get people used to being searched and controlling people, getting used to taking off their shoes, their belts, etc. It does seem like governments are gearing up for further protests and riots. I mean, the Department of Homeland Security in the USA has purchased 1.4 billion rounds of ammunition during a 6-month period. 450 million rounds of hollow point bullets, 200 million rounds of rifle ammunition, 176,000 rounds of hollow point boat tail bullets, which is used as ammo for sniper rifles. Now this seems to far exceed the amount which is used in combat. The war in Iraq consumes about 70 million rounds of ammunition each year. So if you put that in perspective, if you compare that, you can see that really is a very large amount of ammunition they're buying there for some reason. What are they planning? I mean, people talk about FEMA camps, like internment camps that are being constructed in the USA. A bit like concentration camps. It seems like either they're expecting riots and protests or they have something else in mind. Next we're going to go to Anthony, our academic researcher from the University of Bilkent in Turkey, Ankara, and we'll be looking at some of the injustices and the protests uprisings, and particularly focusing on Turkey. It's a good test case for us to look at to see what happens when people protest against a government, and how far governments will go to suppress people who are trying to change the system. And this is the anniversary of the previous protests where Anthony reported that a young boy got shot in the face with a gas canister, tear gas canister. And tear gas seems to be the weapon of choice at the moment. They've also had water cannons, I believe. And it's good for us to focus on this case and just to think, what would happen if there was protests in your country? What would the government reaction be? And so it's good to focus on this case as you have a prime minister, a very arrogant prime minister who wants to suppress these people. Let's see what's happening over there at the moment. Hello, Anthony.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Not too bad. You know, it's been a bit of a busy week, but and I think Truth Sentinel may be a little bit late this week. But apart from that, everything's fine.
Great.
How about yourself?
Yeah, good to be back as usual. It's been an interesting week in Turkey.
Yeah, you've had the riots again in the Taksim Square. Is that right?
They weren't quite as intense as I expected, but yeah, they have been around. I was treated a couple of nights ago to the very disturbing sound of the Islamic call to prayer struggling to be heard over the sound of police helicopters.
Oh, so it must have been very noisy. What time of night was that then?
That was about 10 p.m.
Difficult to sleep if you're in that sort of area, I would have thought.
Yeah, I was in the centre of Ankara, and basically what was happening was the anniversary of the Gezi Park demonstrations, which have become a real rallying point here, I would say. So I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about Gezi Park, what it is and why it's significant, and whether we can see any trends in it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because you know, there's been sort of uprisings in a lot of countries in the last sort of couple of years, ranging from riots to uprisings to complete government takeover, like in Ukraine, for example.
Yeah, before we do that, do you know anything about what's happening in Thailand? Because I just haven't been keeping up with that at all. I figured maybe you have a little bit.
I know that the military stepped in and said, and basically took over, conducted a military coup, which they've done before. I've actually been in Thailand before when that's gone on, and apart from a couple of tanks, you really wouldn't know anything's happening. And usually the military step in when they've had a chat with the king. The king often says something like, this isn't working out, because there's been lots of problems over the last sort of 6 months, and it seems like they've stepped in and taken over basically. And I think elections are due to occur in about a year's time now. But this is kind of normal for Thailand. It just seems like they put someone in power. The people don't like them. There's an uprising, and then the military step in and do another military coup. It's a cycle now.
It does seem to be, it's a very tumultuous political process over there.
It is. Thaksin was ousted before, and to put one of his sisters in power instead doesn't seem to me to have been a good idea.
Fair enough.
Yingluck, I think her name is, Yingluck Shinawatra. Thaksin Shinawatra and Yingluck Shinawatra. Apologies to anyone listening if that's pronounced incorrectly.
There were probably tones and all kinds of things that you missed out there.
There's probably Thais listening and just sighing in dismay, what I just said.
Okay, so so as I said, I wanted to talk about Gezi Park. I don't know if this is a famous phrase internationally or not, but here it's very much, you very much talk about the Gezi Park riots. And basically what happened was that last May a large group of people occupied Taksim Square in Istanbul. If you've been to Istanbul, and if you've been across the river from the old centre, where the Grand Bazaar is and the Blue Mosque and so on, then you've probably seen Taksim. It's a huge open area. I mean, really huge. It can accommodate tens of thousands of people, and it's at the end of a long avenue called Istiklal Caddesi, or Independence Avenue. So the initial protest was a sit-in to contest a development plan. The government basically wanted to put a bridge through Gezi Park, which is adjacent to Taksim, and that would have meant basically destroying much of the park. But the participants in the sit-in were objecting to that because Gezi is part of the lungs of Istanbul. Now, Gezi has been compared to the Occupy movement. Because part of that was also essentially a very large-scale sit-in. But personally, I think it has things in common with a number of protests, and I wanted to mention, I should say protest movements, and I wanted to mention one in particular, which is the S21 protests. These happened in Germany, in Stuttgart, in 2010.
Okay, yeah, please let us know. I wasn't that familiar with these particular protests, so what happened there?
Well, basically, there had been a plan on the table for a while to redevelop Stuttgart's central railway station in a way that would destroy one of the city's largest and most beautiful parks. It's kind of the signature green space of the city. And the protests started peacefully, and they included a large cross-section of people. I mean, we're not just talking about radical uni students. It was the middle class, it was grannies, it was even conservative landowners who didn't want an ugly development spoiling the views from their mansions, But the Premier of Baden-Württemberg, which is the state of which Stuttgart is the capital, he decided that he was going to use these protests to kind of promote a tough guy reputation. And he approved a police response that was unusually heavy-handed and brutal for modern-day Germany. So the police were using pepper spray, water cannon, batons, and there were serious injuries. One pensioner was blinded. There were lots of hospitalizations. So then peaceful sit-in and a couple of marches turned into serious resistance because there was clearly excessive force on the part of the police. So you had more protests, which were then partly motivated by anger. And then the again, the police reaction really stepped up. You know, you had these amazing scenes where police were literally just beating people and dragging them away out of a crowd full of, you know, grandmothers and school kids and so on. It was a really ugly situation. And it freaked the Germans out because, I guess Germany has, I would say, still fairly vivid memories of the 1968 student riots and the Baader-Meinhof gang and all kinds of other stuff that happened in the 60s and early 70s, which I think German society thought that it had moved beyond. You know, but this really brought back all of those memories. Those were very violent protests and a real vote of no confidence in the direction that German society was taking at the time. But look, I also think that S21 is significant because it marked the emergence of a new kind of protest, or a new kind of response to protest, which I think is becoming disturbingly common, and we see it again in Gezi. I mean, we've seen quite a few protest movements springing up in a variety of places over the past 5 years or so. Yeah. And I think these new, harsher responses are basically sending a message, which is that peaceful protests against government or corporate interests are not okay. And if you engage in them, you're risking your safety. So the official line with these things is always that, you know, there were terrorists or extremists or whatever inciting the crowd, you know, so that, oh yes, the vast majority of protesters were peaceful, but then, you know, terrorists or extremists incited them and it turned violent. But actually the incitement tends to come from governments. They deliberately opt for a police response, which is just way out of proportion and incredibly inappropriate, and that stirs things up. So then they can demonize the participants in the protests. You know,
and I think they can do that fairly easily as well using the media. I mean, there was the G8 protests some time ago here in London, and the police actually went in the day before the protests were due to protest and arrested some of them and basically moved them out of their accommodation. One of the protesters was going to jump off a building, saying he didn't want to live in a police state, and they managed to stop him. But it was the first time I've ever heard of anything like that. Arrests being made before protests continued, and I think the general population, they don't care anymore. They just, you know, when the police go in and do something now, for me it's quite serious. It's like, what's happened to peaceful protest? That was part of our laws before, but it just seems like some of the laws have just dropped, and the general population don't seem to care, and they'll quite easily buy into the lies that are put in the media that these are just, you know, extremists, or something like that.
Yeah, and yeah, I totally agree. And you know, you mentioned these police turning up before the protests had started, which makes me think of something which we mentioned on a previous episode, which was when the 14-year-old boy, Turkish boy, Berkin Elvan died. He was a kind of symbol of the protest movement, and his body was interred in a funeral home in Istanbul, and the police turned up the day before the body turned up. Sorry, not the day before. The police turned up on the morning. The body was meant to turn up in the afternoon, and they turned up in riot gear with tear gas and water cannon and the whole box and dice before any of the mourners.
That's very sensitive of them.
It certainly is. But you know, so yeah, I think this is part of the aim, is to demonize the participants by stirring trouble. You know, hopefully you can get a bit of footage of somebody throwing a Molotov or lighting something on fire.
That's what they always do. And I think, talking about the media again, the BBC are the worst for that kind of thing. When I was in Bangkok, I saw hundreds of thousands of people peacefully demonstrating. Very good party, almost party festival kind of atmosphere. And the BBC just stuck one photo of someone throwing a smoke grenade, you know.
Yeah.
Which they must have found in a very isolated part of the protests.
Well, if you can't find that, then the police are not doing their job by the standards of recent years, you know, because these kinds of actions, these throwing the Molotovs and so on, throwing the petrol bombs, smoke bombs, very often with these protests. I mean, certainly with S21 in Stuttgart, that's not what the protesters came to do. It's actually a reaction to the police's behaviour, which is calculated. I mean, there's a precise intention, it seems to me, of making people really, really angry by putting them and the others around them in danger, you know. So I think that these two protests, S21 and Gezi Park, are unfortunately part of a pattern. We can see a lot of parallels between them and elsewhere as well. And the other parallel is that ultimately these are confrontations between police and citizens over projects which will benefit either private interests or the more general goal of progress, as governments like to define it. You know? So in the case of S21, this new railway station development was it was meant to facilitate a high-speed rail link between Paris and Bratislava, which is obviously, you know, 21st century progress. So Angela Merkel was not thrilled that the people of Stuttgart might value their green space more than her exciting railway project. and you know, she got behind the state premier in supporting this fierce police response. And the result was scenes that, you know, we really couldn't have imagined in Germany just a few years before that. But getting back to Gezi Park, it was a similar kind of thing. You know, you had a peaceful sit-in starting on the 28th of May last year, and that was broken up violently by the police. And then you had the PM announcing that, I'll quote him here, "Whatever you do, we've made our decision and we will implement it." And that, coupled with the police violence, just set off a wave of protest of a different kind that wouldn't have occurred at all if the authorities had, you know, gone about things in a smarter and more patient and more moderate kind of way. But of course, here in Turkey, you've got a man in charge who I mean, he's just grown and grown, you know, in terms of his arrogance, I suppose. Every year he's been in power. Erdogan is only in power for one reason, which is that the opposition parties can't sort out their you know, small differences, and they can't field a decent candidate. If they manage to do either or both of those things, then the combined support from the electorate would just blow Erdogan off the world stage permanently.
Do you happen to know how long he stays in power?
He's been there since 2002.
So they don't have a time limit as to how long they can stay in power?
No, I don't believe there's a limit on the number of terms that a prime minister can serve. I think because you see, this is a presidential democracy, and I believe there is a limit on the number of terms that the president can serve, but not the prime minister. I correct me, listeners, if I'm wrong about that, but that's my perception of it. But you know, obviously, he chooses to ignore these facts. And he pretends that he's got this, you know, mandate from the people, which actually seems like kind of an illusion, you know, like with a lot of political leaders. I mean, in Australia, you know, the Conservative government rules the electorate most of the time, but almost never with an absolute majority of the votes. And it's become almost a tradition for Conservative prime ministers to claim that they have a mandate from the people, when in fact more people voted against them than for them.
I believe that's quite similar in the UK as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an expert on how it all works, but I mean, I just know that nothing much ever changes. That's all I know from my point of view. But yeah. I do know that we've got a first past the post system, and that quite often they count up the votes, and it's not the person who's got the most votes that seems to win. It's all a bit strange for me.
Yeah, and of course, you know, in the US, geez, don't even start talking about that system. But anyway, on June the 1st last year, so 3 days after the sit-in had started, and they'd broken it up and sent the people away, the police then retreated from Taksim Square, And then the protesters retook it, and they set up a camp there, which I guess is where the Occupy comparisons come from. Yeah, though of course the same thing happened with S-21, and also more recently with Ukraine and the Maidan. Yeah, and so these demonstrations started then morphing into something different. Again, like the Maidan, they started as a comment on something very specific, this stupid bridge project in Turkey's case. But more and more, they just became protests against the arrogance of the government, you know, and the direction that it's been trying to take Turkey in over the past few years. You know. Very, very broadly, that direction is away from the secular democracy, which was set up by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in the 1920s, and more towards being an authoritarian Islamic republic, we could say, but a fake one. I mean to say that much in the same way that the Republican Party started to court the Christian right vote in the USA in the 90s, the AKP, the ruling party here, Erdogan's party, court the religious right here because they know that it keeps them in power, much more so than because they believe what they're saying. They seem to be fake Muslims, fake authoritarian Islamicists. It's very, very cynical, and it's very, very disturbing.
Do you think there's any chance that you could get a Maidan situation in Turkey there?
We have had it, but it's not. We've had something very like it, but the government here has a much firmer control over the country. I think that Yanukovych never really had the apparatus behind him that Turkey has. You've got to remember, there's a saying: every Turk is a soldier. The army here is huge. So as long as you keep them on side, you're fine. In fact, there's really only two ways it can go. If it comes down to a showdown between the people and the government, it's going to go suppression, or it's going to go military coup.
I wonder how they keep the soldiers on their side then. I mean, are they fairly well paid in Turkey? Do you know?
This I do not know.
Because I just wondered if, you know, like you say, like if the army's so huge, and that's one of the reasons that would prevent an uprising of, you know, on large scale, like how are they keeping all the soldiers on their side when you've got such an arrogant leader like that?
I don't know, but there was a military coup here in the 1980s, and some very bloody scenes ensued. Executions of people who were not supporting the coup, and so on and so on. So it has happened. I believe that was not the first one either. So yeah. But anyway, so the protests, as I said, they evolved into this kind of no confidence vote against the government. Naturally, the government responded by cracking down, as they like to say in the media. And then finally, on the 15th of June last year, they managed to clear Taksim Square again, which seemed like a victory, but actually it set something quite interesting in motion, because the demonstrators, not having their Taksim Square to go to anymore, they started meeting in other places, and the movement spread around the country, and it grew then to just an incredible size. At one point, the estimates are that there were about 5,000 different protest locations. Imagine 5,000 Maidans, right, on a larger or smaller scale, like we had in Ukraine with the Alto Maidan and the regional Maidans, those kinds of things, 5,000 of them, and a total of about 3.5 million protesters, which is just, I mean, that's 3.5 times bigger than the London protest against the invasion of Iraq. So huge. But of course, in Erdogan's speeches, these people were just, again, I'll quote him, just a few looters. Those were his words. But the upshot of this, unfortunately, was basically bloodshed. The police force turned against its own people in the most brutal way. You ended up with something like 15 fatalities, depending on which source you get your numbers from, and about 8,000 citizens injured by police, which is just astonishing, really. You had the water cannon going, which can do some serious harm.
It can blind people, the water cannon can.
It can, and a few days ago, on Taksim Square there was a small protest. Police brought out the water cannons and they shattered the glass on a street vendor's stall, and the glass just flew everywhere. One person ended up in hospital. So water cannon are not fun. Rubber bullets, tear gas canisters, and in some cases the police here developed this exciting technique last year of firing tear gas canisters directly at individuals at point blank range. So it turned into, I would say, I think you could say a fairly disgraceful episode in the country's history.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to say was, like, in case there was any sort of American listeners listening, thinking, what's this got to do with us? Well, I think these kind of things are good sort of experiments for us to see, you know, what could possibly occur in our own countries. I mean, now in the USA, apparently the Department of Agriculture has just been stocking up on hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, and other government departments are as well. Everyone's wondering what's going on because all these government departments are ordering millions of rounds of ammunition, and there's talk of FEMA camps being set up, and it's a lot of people are wondering what are the government expecting to happen over there, because it seems like they're gearing up for mass insurrection or takeover, either from insurrection from the people towards the government, or directly from the government towards the people.
I think it would be incredibly frustrating to be an American and a person who doesn't have faith in their government, because the government has such overwhelming power in the USA. It must seem like an insurmountable force there. Yeah.
Well, I must say, in the UK, I feel like that as well. I feel like, despite people moaning and grumbling sometimes, there's still a large percentage of people in the UK would view the government as looking after their interests, which I don't think is the case, really.
But not only that, if you decided, and if the majority of the people, or a sizable portion of the people, were with you, that you were going to take on the government, which is something which I believe Americans are allowed to do under certain circumstances. In fact, I believe that is the origin of the right to bear arms, that if the government essentially hijacks the course of the country's development in a way which doesn't express the will of the people, then or threatens to enslave the people, whatever, oppress the people, then the people themselves have a right, and I believe even a responsibility, to do something about that. But nowadays, I can't imagine in a country that spends more on military hardware than the next 20 countries behind them put together. It must just feel like an overwhelming task, I don't know. But anyway, sorry.
I was going to mention drones as well. There seems to be quite a number of governments that are starting to bring in drone technology, and we've got our first drones flying over the UK. Well, I'll say drone because I've only got one recorded evidence in the media that being reported on one military drone flying over the UK. But in the US, I think Obama recently mentioned that they were going to be bringing drones in over there as well. And and apparently during the last Champions League football final, there was drones going overhead the stadium there as well.
So far in Australia, the only drones that have been spotted are actually inside Parliament House. But did you see the story about the drones in India, the drone pizza delivery?
I did, yeah, and I just thought, well, if I see a pizza flying over my house and I'm particularly hungry, then I don't think it's going to be too long before either computer hackers are going to redirect those pizzas, or someone's just going to shoot them down,
Yeah. I think it's it's a brilliant story. I would almost count it as a form of satirical comment,
One thing I've noticed about the drones, though, and call me paranoid or conspiratorial, but
you're quite paranoid, Scott, and a little bit conspiratorial.
Later. I meant later. Basically, me and my friends have been noticing that there's been a lot of stories being released about drones, and almost turn them into little cuddly toys that we're not to be afraid of.
Really?
There was a I think a Valentine drone story about, I'm not exactly sure what it was about, but it was basically sort of linking romance and drones together. And there's the pizza drones.
Oh,
Like, don't be worried about drones; they can deliver pizzas. Then there was the Amazon drone, or they can deliver all our products. So it's almost like it seems like they're trying to get people used to the idea of drones as being friendly little things that will help you with your pizzas and shopping, and even with a bit of romance as well. Valentine's Day drones. And
so we're gonna see them start helping old ladies across the street pretty soon.
exactly. And then when the serious ones come along with their guns and start shooting everyone, people will be like, "What? I thought they were friendly."
Oh my god. I can just imagine a kind of Hello Kitty style, like drone backpacks and drone t-shirts.
Exactly.
I was talking about all this Gezi Park stuff because it's been a year. Yesterday was 2 days ago was the anniversary, and in the year that's elapsed in between, I mean, we've talked about some of the stuff that's happened here. I've talked about the death of the 14-year-old Birkin Elvan.
Yep.
We talked about the false flag operation that was planned in Syria, the attacks on social media, and so on. And two things we haven't mentioned. One, just a detail, but I think it's a really nasty one, which deserves to be well known. One of the government's cruelest moves here, I would say, which is that they enacted a law earlier this year, which said that if a doctor or another medical professional was caught giving medical treatment to a wounded protester, the doctor could be arrested and prosecuted. That was a real masterpiece, I think.
That's very nice, isn't it?
Yeah. And the other thing that we didn't talk about was how Erdogan's government, not uniquely, has used the popularity of conspiracy theories, to get their own conspiracies up and running and try to use those to influence public opinion in their favor. Now, this is another really disturbing trend, of course, and it's a tactic that Vladimir Putin's particularly fond of, you may have noticed. We've seen how well it works in eastern Ukraine. So, for example, a few days ago, there was a woman burying her husband in Donetsk after the government there retook Donetsk airport from primarily a bunch of foreign mercenaries, and the group of people who took Donetsk airport on Monday were basically foreign mercenaries and proponents of this idea of Greater Russia, which includes trying to absorb some Ukrainian territory, in much the same way that Hitler tried to absorb Czechoslovakia and Poland. Yeah. These guys, that's their deal. This Novorossiya, the Greater Russia. So the government took the airport back, and this woman's husband was there fighting with these expansionist neo-Nazi nutjobs who are masquerading as freedom fighters fighting against the fascists, and he took a bullet from the Ukrainian military, but his wife's comment to the media was that he'd been shot by, and I quote, an American sniper. Now, we know what the information climate is like in Ukraine. Any piece of, completely unsubstantiated bullshit becomes fact within days, maybe even hours. If the story suits the worldview of the people who are relaying the story. So, and we also know that Russians have been told for decades about this threat of being surrounded, encircled, of the various international plots to bring their country down. It's on the history syllabus at St. Petersburg University. These international conspiracies to destroy Russia, whether it be by Jews or Americans or whatever. And so they love a conspiracy theory in Russia. So that American sniper story, I have no doubt, is fact by now.
That'll be on RT later, I'm sure.
Yeah, no doubt. So the government here are also trying to harness this power of conspiracies. Now, what you might call conspiracy theory inversion, where instead of people calling out governments on their dodgy behavior, and governments maintaining the usual plausible denial stuff, the politicians themselves are creating the theories, but the theories are about their people or about each other. So in Turkey's case, there's not so much paranoia about encirclement and foreign influences as there is in Russia, although, Erdogan does occasionally mention foreign influences in his rants. But what he started to specialize in is claiming that the opposition parties are involved in all kinds of conspiracies and also community groups. So you've got him alleging, for example, that the leader of the CHP, the liberal opposition, is engineering this mass movement through like a network of shadowy cabals, and that this is where Taksim and all this stuff is coming from. The goal is to bring about a mass movement which will ultimately undermine the unity of Turkey and allow all kinds of horrible stuff to happen, and it's nothing to do with the people's will, and it's everything to do with conspiracy.
And he's trying to turn him into the victim of this, of these people as well, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as anyone can tell, obviously it's all hot air, but it plays well to a certain segment of the electorate, which is a scary thing, because again, it shows how governments are gaining the ability to co-opt this idea of conspiracy and use it to protect themselves. So he also, by the way, called the leader of the opposition a terrorist, which is one of our favourite words in this century, and claimed that the opposition party were working with terrorists. And nowadays, of course, you just throw that word at anyone who dislikes you and who's prepared to do something about it, no matter what that thing is.
Exactly, yeah.
Just like the Beijing government does, every time the Uyghur province and the Uyghur in Xinjiang province fights back there, the government have conducted a long-running campaign to completely fuck them socioeconomically and remove all traces of their ancient culture and so on. And occasionally, somebody there gets angry and, again, throws a Molotov cocktail, sets something on fire, and so they're all just terrorists. Yeah. And in the case of Erdogan, he also said the same thing this week about anniversary commemorations. They were being engineered by terrorists whose aim was to undermine the republic, and so on, which is a really vacuous thing to say, but that's the standard of public discourse these days, as we've seen in many cases. So anyway, this month there have been more deaths potentially traceable to Gezi Park. There was a guy who recently died of cancer. His name was Mehmet Istif. Many people here believe that he contracted the cancer. He contracted the cancer last year when the police shot tear gas directly into his mouth during the Gezi protests in his hometown. And there have been several others. So
what happened when they did that?
So his mouth filled up with tear gas, and he was rushed to hospital.
I might imagine it could be poisonous, isn't it?
It's certainly not something that you want in your mouth.
No.
There was another woman that who had a heart attack as a result of intense tear gas inhalation. She died this week. You've had 2 protesters killed in Istanbul this week by police. And then on Saturday you had the Gezi Park anniversary, which I mentioned before. Big gatherings in Istanbul, here in Ankara, elsewhere around the country. So basically the government deployed 25,000 police officers and 50 water cannon trucks to Taksim Square. Now that's just an unimaginable number, and they laid on a bunch of armored vehicles, helicopters, and so on, just to prevent a gathering. Yeah. And meanwhile, the Prime Minister is as cocky as ever. On Saturday afternoon, another quote from him, he says, "You will not be able to come to those places like you did last year because the police have taken absolute orders and they will do all."
He sounds horrible. I mean, for people who don't particularly respect authority, then he's the worst kind of person who's in power at the moment. I imagine this kind of, the way he's reacting is just going to make people want to rise up even more.
Yeah, and when he says the police take absolute orders and they will do all, what does that mean? I thought that was rather scary. So
Probably intended to be scary, wasn't
yeah,
it?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think so. So on Friday night in Ankara, you had the same kind of thing, just on a slightly smaller scale. I was here in the center. You had helicopters flying around all evening. You could feel a kind of tickle in your throat, which is what you get from a distance if there's tear gas being deployed. You had the water cannons out. By the way, Istanbul is facing severe water shortages this summer because the water levels in the reservoirs that supply the city are just catastrophically low this year. And on one of the English-speaking Turkish media websites, there was a great little juxtaposition last week. There was a story about the water shortages, and in the sidebar on the right of the page, you could click and link to a story about the police using 40 water cannons on protesters. So, but anyway, I was a couple of kilometers away from one of the flashpoints. I could hear occasional gunshots. Don't know what kind of ordnance it was, but the protests died down around 11 p.m. This organization that Erdogan has branded as terrorists. They're called Taksim Solidarity. They were on Independence Avenue in Istanbul around 7:30 p.m. saying, "No matter what, we'll never move." But by about 10:30, most of them had gone home. So what the next chapter is, I have no idea. It seemed like it was going to be huge. It was less huge than people were anticipating. Certainly less huge than the government were anticipating with their 25,000 police officers. So what happens now? I just really don't know.
Well, it remains to be seen. And anyway, at least we know that we can rely on you to keep us on update on it. I think it is good to watch these kind of events to see what could happen in our own countries. I mean, I think there's a real thin line between peace and then total disorder. I mean, we saw in London how quickly things can turn around and how quickly it can turn into kind of like a riot kind of zone. I think it could happen anywhere, especially with the current economic climate. I mean, there's predictions this year of a possible economic collapse, and if that happens, then maybe this is the kind of thing that they're preparing for in America for the for when the economy collapses, how to deal with the uprisings that are going to occur.
Yeah, I even know people in Australia who are saying that they're ready to fight, and Australia has, for a country that was founded on such fighting ideals, Australia is very, very passive these days. To start hearing Australian people say that they're quote unquote ready to go to war, as I heard one Australian say a few days ago, that's quite extreme. That's not something you hear.
What kind of things are they unhappy about at the moment?
Oh, how much?
If you could summarise in a couple of sentences,
as I mentioned before, Australia's been ruled by conservative governments for most of its history, and it seems that each one becomes more extreme than the last. So, they're actually, one of their projects seems to be eroding the separation of church and state, which is a really interesting project in this day and age, I must say. And the usual stuff, gutting the education system and health and so on and so on. It's really it's getting beyond the pale there now.
Are people losing trust in the government there?
People didn't have any trust in the government to begin with, but they didn't realise just how far they were going to go. And it's there was an article in the New York Times about a week ago saying that Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister of Australia, is one of the world's most unpopular prime ministers, which is pretty funny considering some of the stuff we've just been talking about. So that will give you an idea of the climate there. I don't think there's going to be an uprising in Australia. I think Australia is far too settled and comfortable for that.
That's what I think, actually. I mean, I was just thinking that in places like the USA, the UK, it's slightly different environment. I don't think it would be easy to have a mass uprising with the support of most of the population. I think it tends to be younger people, student types, or a certain type of people, but certainly a minority. And whereas the rest of society seems to be sort of happy in its almost like ignorance of what's actually really is going on.
Yeah, and I mean, in some ways, that has been the case in most of the great revolutions in history, and most of the catastrophically failed revolutions in history. I mean, everything from Lenin's frustration was palpable, and he wrote voluminously about the fact that the masses could not be incited to rise up in the way that he assumed they would and thought they should. So then they had to, they being the Bolsheviks, had to assume another model. Instead of this great popular uprising, they had to have an uprising that was led by the vanguard, in the hope that the great mass of the population would eventually wake up and go, "Oh yeah, you guys are right. Yeah, it is nice having a new system." Revolutionaries everywhere have been facing that for a long time, and in fact, some of the most nasty little minds of our time. Let's take as an example Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was Osama bin Laden's number 2. Had exactly the same situation. He had believed for decades that the masses would rise up and overthrow the corrupt regimes of various Islamic countries. And when they didn't do so, he decided that he was going to have to resort to more extreme means, which just alienated more and more people until there was only one real course left to them, which is to attack the great Satan. Yeah. So yeah, this is not a new thing. By the way, Scott, I just wanted to say one thing about something that was mentioned earlier. In the part of our interview about Ukraine, I mentioned that the people who had taken Donetsk airport were neo-Nazis. Thinking about that as we've been talking, I realized that it was a bit of a rash thing to say, in the sense that I don't want to brand everybody in the People's Republic of Donetsk as a neo-Nazi, because that's certainly not the case. I only meant to say that some of the people involved in that particular action have concrete links to the far right wing in Russia, and that their capture of the airport was a response to the new president's expressed wish to come and negotiate in Donetsk. And these guys, this particular group of guys, are not at all interested in negotiation, and that's what brought about the action of taking the airport, which then led to the government taking it back and all of the casualties. But a lot of people involved, even in that action, I would say, were local residents who just believe that they're fighting for their homeland or whatever. But I would maintain that quite a few of the people who are orchestrating this are people with far right credentials, who are playing a double game there and are very much playing the Eastern Ukrainians off against the Western Ukrainians. So those are the people I was referring to earlier. Certainly not the entire republic or even the entire fighting force.
No, fair enough. Talking of Ukraine, hopefully Truth Sentinel will be doing another report from inside Ukraine in the next few weeks, hopefully.
Mm. You're headed back there?
Maybe. It's not 100% certain, but certainly it looks like it.
Okay.
Just to see what the mood is again over there, and
to take advantage of the cheap, strong liquor.
Oh damn it! You've sussed me out straight away. Anyway, thank you for coming on the show today, Anthony.
It's been a pleasure as always.
Keep us up to date with what's going on. I hope to speak to you again soon.
Yeah, you too. And I'm looking forward to hearing your reports from Ukraine.
Okay, thank you.
No problem, Scott. Talk to you soon.
Okay, speak to you soon.
Bye.
So let me know what you think about protest. Is it the way to go? Have you ever taken part in protests? Do you think violent protest is the only answer, or are you an advocate of peaceful protest? Personally, I think we can achieve a lot just by getting information out and fighting against the mainstream media, and investigating more, asking more questions than the mainstream media, and getting people to start to realize that we're not being presented with the truth by our governments, by the media. And so, as Alex Jones says, there is a war on for people's minds, and we can fight in that kind of war. I think we can engage in peaceful protests as well, although how long they're going to remain peaceful. In a lot of cases, violence seems to occur, whether it be through people who have decided to join the protest just because they like to attack people. Anyway, thanks for listening today. We're always grateful. Remember, the greatest enemy of truth is blind belief in authority, as said by Albert Einstein. Finally, a black bear has been caught on camera lying down in a hammock in the US state of Florida. Homeowner Vincent James said the animal climbed in and laid back like it was a tourist. Something scared him, but then about half an hour he came back, and there he was, back in the hammock again, taking it easy. And I think we need to take it easy sometimes as well, despite the fact there's lots of unrest and protests and injustice in the world. We have to take time out and just realise that there's some good things going on too, and there's always nature to enjoy, and we can always relax like that bear did. Hope you have a fantastic week, everyone. Thanks for listening. Catch you later. Goodbye.